All right, so today's webinar is not 90 minutes, today's 60 minutes, so I'm going to dive straight in. This topic came to us, somebody at GIZ Fabric emailed me one day and said, have you ever heard of the Chancery Lane Project? And I said, no, I've never heard of it. What is it? And someone explained it to me, and I went and had a look at the website, and I was immediately attracted to what the Chancery Lane project is doing. As it says in your invitation, it's a collaborative initiative of international legal and industry professionals whose vision is a world where every contract enables solutions to climate change. And I really think this is a very interesting idea. It's something that I hadn't seen before, and I've spoken to several other people as we were organizing this webinar, and they hadn't heard of it either. So I really think there's some really interesting information coming up for you today. We've got 3 people from the Chancery Lane Project. We've got Becky Anderson, who's the Director of Engagement. We've got Ben Metz, who's the Executive Director of the Chancery Lane Project. And we've also got Larissa Lambourne, who is a Senior Project Associate with the project as well. So to get things underway as fast as we can, I'm going to hand it straight over to Chancery Lane and let them fill you in on exactly what they do. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you very much. As Stephen said, I'm Ben. I'm the Exec Director of the Chancery Lane Project. I'm not a lawyer, one of the very few who aren't. George, could you pull the slides up, please? And but I work with lawyers because I realize the great power that they have to affect climate action, from the great responsibility they have through writing contracts. Next slide, please, and then the one immediately after. I'm just providing a 1 or 2 minute overview. So when you look at the field of mainstream law, you find lots of different components and lots of different elements influencing mainstream law. But when people think about the intersection of climate or the environment and law, next slide, please, they usually think about litigation or attempts at legislative or regulatory change. Next slide, please. They do not think about contracts. Contracts are 95% of the business of law, and they are 100% of the glue that holds our global economy together. Next slide, please. So there are 166 companies that are responsible for more than 80% of industrial emissions. And we think our best guess is somewhere between 50 and 100 global elite law firms which control and manage in excess of 80% of the contracts that govern those emissions. Lawyers work generally from standard form contracts, which are templated usually on a sector-by-sector basis, and there are less than 50 standard form contract regulators or maintainers that, again, we think control in excess of 80% of the contracts that govern the global economy. Next slide, please. So, thank you. So just dipping my toe into the world of the fashion industry, when you look around the reports, and you guys, I'm sure, will have read more reports than me, a conservative estimate of global emissions contributed by the fashion industry is around 4%. I've seen estimates of up to 10. And 20% of wastewater, which seems like a pretty consistent figure, is contributed by the fashion industry. Interestingly, thank you, McKinsey, for the next 2, a 2021 study by McKinsey for the next 2 bullets. There's a concentration of that climate impact in upstream activities. Circa 70% of that impact happens upstream and 30% downstream. And very interestingly, and really the central focus of this seminar and of our activities, is the fashion industry is on target to get halfway towards meeting the Paris 1.5 degree target by 2030. There's a very clear gap in the fashion industry as it intersects with law. We don't see this as a weakness. We see this as a huge opportunity. There's no clear cohort of global elite law firms engaged across the fashion industry in the way that you see leading law firms engaging across other sectors. And so far, maybe somebody on this call can correct us, we don't see any standard form contract regulators. So there's no single source of truth for contracts. And as I said, we see this as a huge opportunity for the fashion industry to engage with rapid and deep decarbonisation in line with making more efforts towards that target of 1.5 by 2030. That's it from me. I'll hand on to Clarissa and Becky.
Thanks, Ben. Hello, everybody. I'm Clarissa Lambourne. I'm a senior project associate at TCLP. Before that, I was a lawyer specializing in commercial transactions and project finance in the Philippines. And let me just introduce my colleague as well. She's Becky Anderson. She is the Director of Engagement at TCLP. She was an in-house lawyer for 12 years at a large multinational company where she specialized in commercial contracts and particularly in outsourcing. So let me just take you through kind of the agenda of what we're going to be chatting about. So to start off, we'll talk a bit about the concept behind our organization. We'll tell you about who we are and what we do, and then take you through some of the resources we have freely available. Then we'll go into what you can do with our materials to combat the climate crisis, and also some case studies of people who are already using our materials to cut their carbon. Could I have the slides back up, please, George? Thank you very much. Perfect. So why should we use contracts? As Ben mentioned, regulation is a powerful tool, but then it's really quite slow. That's where a lot of the climate action is. Then there's also litigation, but then which is important to keep everyone accountable and forms a significant risk for companies. However, at this point, by the time litigation commences, the carbon has already been emitted. So in between these, there is contracts and all the quasi-legal work that goes into supporting businesses do their day jobs. Contracts are fast, bespoke, familiar, and legally enforceable. They give you a clear means to deliver on your climate goals. And this is the starting point of the Chancery Lane Project. So our concept in the beginning was to take the idea of contracting for climate goals and mobilize the legal profession to draft clauses and other tools to get it done. It has been an overwhelming success, and we now turn to the really tough work of actually putting the clauses into the contracts. Next slide, please. The Chancery Lane Project is a nonprofit pro bono organization that brings together lawyers and business leaders to use the power of climate contracting to deliver rapid decarbonization at scale. Our community includes over 2,300 professionals and over 300 participating organizations, including every single top 25 law firm in the UK. All our materials are free and everything we do is funded by philanthropic grant money. Next slide, please. We have some core values that underpin all of the work that we do at TCLP. First, we are independent of any professional body or practice. We are politically neutral. We foster a safe space to innovate as published drafting is unattributable to individual firms or lawyers that worked on it. All of our clauses and content is free to use and adapt. It's open source for our community to adapt as they need it. And we encourage and promote collaboration and cross-fertilization across industry sectors and legal practice areas. Next slide, please. At TCLP, we are motivated by the fact that postponing transformational climate action is not an option. We believe that the legal sector has valuable skills, tools, and levers to deliver that action and is a very necessary part of the transformation. So our goal is to shift the dial and make climate-conscious drafting that seems ambitious now the norm as quickly as possible. Each year, we report on our progress against these goals in our impact report, which is available to download on our website. Next slide, please. To that end, so we have a lot of resources, actually. We are proud of the more than 120 climate clauses published on our website to date. So this gives you a starting point to change your own contracts. We also have a comprehensive glossary of terms used throughout our drafting. It not only provides standard definitions for your contracts for common climate terms such as scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions or greenhouse gas emissions, but it's also a great reference guide. So if there's a climate term that's unfamiliar to you, there's a good chance that we have a clear explanation of it in our glossary. Each clause and glossary term published on our website has been through a rigorous peer review process and has a detailed user guide which sits behind it. These are all available on our website. This essential guidance contains details of the climate issue the clause is seeking to address, the commercial and environmental context, and other useful user notes for people actually using and drafting the clause into the contract. Next slide, please. We also have a net zero toolkit. The toolkit helps people amend their contracts today to meet their net zero goals. They explain the concept of net zero, help practitioners to choose the right climate clauses for their agreements, and know the key issues to look out for when including net zero commitments into contracts. We appreciate that many people will not know what net zero is, why it may be important to businesses, and how to help them, and it's a little bit difficult to understand how to get there. So the first part of our net zero toolkit is all about getting people up to speed with knowledge and understanding, all in the context of contracting and what you can do in your day-to-day work to embed net zero. We have a net zero video. In our resource kit. It's an introduction to the concept of net zero and some of the key issues those using the clauses need to know. It's about 10 minutes long and a great resource to show at a team meeting or a client training event, but it's only an introduction to get you started. We also have sorry, if you can move back one slide, please. The Net Zero Explainer is a more detailed document giving you more information and links to resources to help you direct your own learning. It teases out important concepts like the difference between net zero and carbon neutral. We also have a net transition map pictured on the slide. It is to assist companies in understanding where climate clauses will fit within your organization's transition to net zero. Next slide, please. So to give you an idea of the breadth of our clauses, this clause timeline breaks down a few of them across the legal life cycle, from corporate governance to due diligence to procurement and dispute. So our clauses are not static, and we really hope that they're used as inspiration and not an endpoint for climate conscious drafting. Clauses are named after children close to the people who drafted it. This is to remind all of us that the work we do is for future generations. So our clauses span a range of climate ambition from light green to dark green. A light green clause is low ambition. It has low climate impact, but equally is simple and easy to implement. We would recommend starting with a light green clause such as Eddie's recitals. This is a simple clause you put in the background section of a contract. It doesn't create a legally binding obligation, but it sets the stage for future work and puts climate clearly in the minds of everyone as they negotiate the contract. Then you can take increasingly more ambitious clauses until you are implementing Paris-aligned climate clauses such as Owen's clause, which is a clause that sets a climate emissions target as a proportion of a company's own net zero target, and that target will then reduce over the life of the contract. And if a supplier fails to hit the target, then they can either be terminated or pay for carbon offsets. But following this contractual life cycle, you can see how many intervention points there are in the contractual and quasi-contractual stages to set up these clauses for success. And Becky will talk about that a little more later on, so look forward to that. Next slide, please. This is our net zero dashboard. The dashboard is a simple graphic we have created for an organization to map itself against. You can determine the level of ambition for your net zero goals and see the goals and targets that would move across from left to right. So the column on the left represents the low ambition, arguably no ambition climate targets. For instance, you only look at scope 1 emissions, you're on target for a temperature rise above 2 degrees Celsius, etc. The column on the right is all the metrics that align with high ambition targets in line with the Paris Agreement. You can see where an organization sits in relation to these 7 key areas, and then it gives you the targets to help you level up your contracts along a pathway to net zero. So our clauses span the entire pathway, again, from low ambition light green, such as Eddie's recitals, all the way through to high ambition dark green clauses, such as Owen's clause. And with that, I will now pass on to Becky, who will take you through this with a little more detail.
Thank you. If you could move on to the next slide, George, that'd be fantastic. Thank you. And before I stop properly, I'm going to make two confessions to you all. Firstly, I'm actually sitting in a room which is about 300 meters away from a train line. Occasionally, I might mute myself if there's a train going past. So please bear with me while that happens, and I do apologize. The second confession I have is that I have never worked in the fashion industry. All my legal expertise in outsourcing is in a completely different industry, but I'm going to try and draw across as many lessons from that as may be useful. I will almost certainly make some missteps, and I look forward to you all challenging me at the end in the Q&A section on how I've got it all horribly wrong. So with that in mind, I'm just going to crack on and cross my fingers. So every industry has unique circumstances and challenges. Of course, what will work well in one industry will not work in another. I don't need to tell you that, I'm sure. And we are going to now start looking at climate clauses, all these materials we have. How will they apply to the fashion industry? Will they even apply? I think that the dirty truth here is that most of our clauses work best in industries where the parties have equal or near equal bargaining power. Otherwise, you will start to end up with some of the issues on the slide. In particular, the risk is going to sit with the party who has the least bargaining power. There's a train, sorry. The risk will end up sitting with the party who has the least bargaining power, not the party who is best placed to bear that risk, or potentially not the party who is best placed to ensure carbon reduction. So in this section, I'll be talking about our clauses, how to use them, in particular, how to use them to avoid greenwashing. And by that, what I mean, when I say avoid greenwashing, I don't mean avoid getting caught out doing the wrong thing. I mean, we really need to get this carbon out. Greenwashing doesn't get the carbon out. We need to get the carbon out. So what are we going to do to make sure that that happens? And I think what needs to happen here, in order for our clauses to really fly and be successful, there needs to be incredibly strong partnership between suppliers, manufacturers and the brands. And there also needs to be incredibly strong leadership from the brands and the buyers to make it work. I'm going to choose a particular clause here. It's called Owen's clause. I'm going to explain to you what it does. I'm going to explain why I think it's probably not going to work in the fashion industry as it is. And in a few slides' time, I'm going to talk about how somebody else adapted it for the construction industry in a way that I think might work here. And you might be asking yourself, why am I selling you a climate solution by telling you it's not going to work? But I think that deconstructing this clause in particular, which is a deep decarbonisation clause, and why I think it will come up against problems in the fashion industry, I think that exercise in and of itself is going to be really useful to show you where in the contracts that you work with, you might need to make changes in the right place. Because sometimes it's not just about getting a decarbonisation clause into a contract, it's about looking at where carbon is being locked up in the terms of the contract as it currently sits. Because whilst we come here and say contracts are important and vital tools for decarbonisation, of course, the reverse is also true. The carbon emissions and the GHG emissions that we have across the entire global economy are locked up and enforced by contracts. And that's why we think we need to get into the contracts and unlock them. So what does Owen's clause do? So Owen's clause is a decarbonisation clause, which is aimed very squarely at those scope 3 emissions, so the supply chain emissions. And I think from that McKinsey report, it's that 70% of upstream emissions that is being in that report. In that clause does 4 things. The first thing it does is it requires your supplier or your manufacturer to have a net zero target and to align that net zero target with the brand or the buyer's net zero target, so that they're all lined up and pointing in the same direction, going at the same pace. Second, it sets a carbon target or a carbon footprint target for the contract itself. So the first is it requires the supplier to have a net zero target for its entire business, which is aligned. But the second is we're going to say for this particular contract, it has a carbon target of X. So many gigatons or tons. Then it requires on the anniversary date of the contract, carbon target, that carbon footprint number must be reduced by X%. And you would negotiate what that percentage is for you. And that percentage should be looked at with regard to your industry, your sector, but also how you're going to achieve your net zero goals and by when. And lastly, and this touches on something that Clarissa mentioned, if that carbon target number is missed, then it either allows the buyer or the brand to terminate the contract and perhaps engage somebody who can meet the target, or it requires the supplier to pay liquidated damages penalties, which the buyer must spend on procuring offsets for the amount of carbon the target was missed by. An imperfect attempt to remedy the fact that an emission occurred. But of course, the important thing here, or one of the important things, is that the buyer or the brand does not get a windfall from that money. Now, in some industries, this is a fantastic tool, and this clause is already being used by 4 large organizations in their supply chains to help them decarbonize. I think in historically low margin, unequal bargaining power sectors, this clause is going to run into trouble. Because I think what this clause does is that it shifts the risk down the supply chain, obviously, because, you know, as we've seen from that McKinsey report, a lot of the carbon emissions, the direct carbon emissions are coming out of the supply chain. But where you have a party, a supplier that is operating on incredibly tight margins, it becomes incredibly hard for the party to bear the risk, even though the emissions might be happening, they are doing the work. If they are operating on such tight margins, they can't make the necessary changes to their business model to reduce the carbon. That means the carbon won't be reduced. And what I always say to people here is, you take Owen's clause, the line, decarbonisation clause, and put in your agreement. But if you haven't made an environment, both contractually and in your business relationship, for Owen's clause to succeed, all you will end up doing is getting those liquidated damages. And I think that that's a real problem, because liquidated damage offset, which is a solution, but offsets, no offset regime is currently as good, I don't believe, as making sure that that carbon is just not emitted in the first place. You know, how many offset regimes require you to, or rely on you buying a piece of forest that already exists, only for that forest to burn down in a wildfire and release even more carbon? So for me, getting to that liquidated damages point is never going to be as good as making sure the carbon doesn't come out in the first place. And I'm really, I suppose, talking to the brands at the moment, because I think that you probably have more power here in determining what goes into the contracts. So if you do want to take a full decarbonisation clause and make it work in your contract, what are the steps that you need to go through? If you could move on to the next slide, please, George. Thank you very much. So for me, you start in the boardroom of the organisation with the power. You start then with education, and then you start by giving power to your suppliers through stakeholder relationships. And these are the things that the people who are successfully using our clauses have told us that they are doing to make those clauses a success. So not just having the clauses accepted into contracts, but having the carbon actually come out. Starting at board level then. So embedding climate consideration in the decision-making process is absolutely key. Obviously, when we have leadership putting climate issues at the forefront of their strategy, this climate mindset first can easily throw through an organization, giving employees, giving supply chain partners the agency to do the same. And I suppose that I should just be really clear here. What I mean by starting at board level is the reality of our situation, all of our situations in climate, is that we are going to have to pay for change to happen, sometimes doing things in a less carbon intensive way or in a way which has less waste in it means that we have to take less profit. It's going to cost some money. And those decisions really need to be taken in the boardroom, because if you try and take them too far down the chain in the company, all that will happen is you will come up against the quarterly budget requirements that have been set by the board, and it will fail. The board is also going to be setting its net zero strategy. So they are going to be in the best position to assess and say to themselves, okay, well, we have a contract here where, so there's a chain, hang on. We have a contract here which is going to account for almost all of our emissions target this year if we sign up to it. But if we just accept that we are going to make 0.5% less profit on this contract, actually we can make these small amount of changes which is going to cut that carbon by half. And those sort of decisions need to be taken, I think, at a boardroom and then flowed all the way through the company. Now, we have a clause that helps with that. We have GRIF's board minutes. And what these board minutes do is require a company, every time it has a significant transaction, they have to carbon footprint and look at the climate impact of that transaction. And I think in some ways this is absolutely intuitive and absolutely necessary, because the example I always give is that if you were trying to lose weight and you were setting yourself a weight loss target, but you never counted your calories or reviewed what you ate and you just ate whatever you felt like, then obviously you would never meet your target. And I feel the same very, very much when it comes to companies and their net zero targets. If you are a company who has set a net zero target and you are not assessing every single significant transaction coming through your pipeline, what are the future emissions of that transaction? Then you have no idea how much carbon you are eating. GRIF's board minutes is going to break it down for you. And of course, there comes a problem, because once you have broken it down and you have your flagship deal and you know how much money you're going to be making on it, and then you suddenly know how much carbon it's going to cost you, it's very hard to run away from that. So I think that GRIF board minutes is both an easy clause to implement, because the day you implement it, it's not going to really cost you a lot of money, but it is going to give you information which you cannot hide from. I think that ways that we can also build things into the system to help with get-wins clause, that decarbonisation clause, successful, is firstly these board minutes, so that people can make informed decisions about how much they are willing to spend on making sure that decarbonisation happens. You can also tie an executive or director's remunerations to the company's environmental targets and then flow that all the way through, so that everybody's bonuses in a company are partially dependent on achieving climate targets as well as achieving various profit metrics. And that will signal to the company and to the public and to the employees and to the suppliers that this is something that you're taking really seriously, that you are prepared to put a part of your bonus, or you're prepared to put a part of your profit margin on the line to make sure the carbon comes out. So I think that this is a really good place where brands and buyers can look at their very large contracts in light of the overall carbon footprint of the deal. And I think that doing it at this stage, doing it at the boardroom stage, before people are emotionally committed to a deal, before people have put huge amounts of work and time and effort into a deal and made it really hard for them to say, actually, this doesn't work for us because the climate's wrong, we need to change the profit margin, we need to change this. Doing it at a much earlier stage leaves you far more free to make those big and important changes. I think education, I'll just move on to the next bit there. Education is also critically important. It's critically important in any company. I think this is also an easy way for brands to support their suppliers. Large companies now are often doing climate training for their own staff. Large companies who've set net zero obligations very publicly, and they're now running education programs for their own staff on those net zero targets and how they're going to achieve them, or even just what net zero is in the wider context. I think that this is something where you can very easily invite your suppliers to webinars that you are running as a brand. Invite your manufacturers along to the same training that you're giving to your staff. I think in this day and age where you can just record a webinar of your internal training and disseminate it to other people, it's a really cheap and effective way to do that. Many years ago, this is when I was in practice, the UK brought in the Bribery Act. This is a very significant piece of legislation. And one of the things that my company did at the time, and I was in charge of running that program, was to do training for our own staff internally on the Bribery Act to make sure that everybody was compliant with it. And we invited all of our key suppliers to attend that training as well. So we knew as a company that our key suppliers our key manufacturers had had the same level of training as our staff, but it also meant for our key suppliers and our key manufacturers, many of whom might have been small to medium businesses, medium enterprises, who did not have the ability or the resources to put their own training process in place. They didn't have to pay for that because they could just get ours for free. So everybody got a huge benefit out of that. And engagement, the third block on my slide there, we have found at the Chancery Lane Project that those companies who have strongly engaged with their suppliers as early as possible and engaged with them as trusted stakeholders have had the greatest success in getting climate clauses into the contract and getting carbon reductions from those clauses. Companies who have held meetings with their suppliers and asked the suppliers to come up with proposals, come up with solutions. Many of those solutions were just brilliant because, of course, the suppliers and the manufacturers will probably know best how to reduce their own carbon emissions if they're given the necessary support. Maybe they need small tweaks to the process of a manufacturing contract, which will allow a big carbon saving at a small amount of extra cost and inconvenience to a brand. Asking then those questions and then going back up to the board and saying, this is the proposal, can we do this? Before you even start looking at what you might want to put in your contracts, is going to set your contracts up for success. I'm just going to pause for a train again, I apologise. So I think the suppliers will know also not just where in their processes they are able to make the best savings for carbon, but in particular industries like fashion. But I also think, like my own industry that I was operating in for many years, of the industry of construction, the suppliers and the manufacturers and the contractors will also know where the other terms in the contract are preventing them from reducing their carbon emissions by locking them in to terms on price or delivery, locking them into terms which create waste in the system, which seems to be unavoidable because if they don't follow that process, then they will be in breach of contract. They will also be able to tell you where in the contracts that is a problem and where carbon savings can be unlocked by unlocking other terms, not just putting in a brand new clause about decarbonisation. And I will talk about that in a little bit on a later slide. But part of what is really important here for us is that the carbon actually comes out and that nobody is left behind as we globally transition into a decarbonised economy. If you could move on to the next slide, please. Thank you very much. So I talked about the first three steps that you want to take: boardroom, education, engagement. These, I would say, are the next three steps. I think anybody who's ever been through a tender process, there's always a due diligence phase. This is a really important place. This is a place where you can find out, yes, which of your suppliers is able to help you meet your net zero goals, but it will also show you where your suppliers need extra support. Because one of the things that I always think is if you've got a fantastic supplier who is delivering all the things that you need and is absolutely brilliant, but they haven't yet got it quite right on environment and on carbon, you're not going to ditch a brilliant supplier just because they can't do the carbon piece. This is a great opportunity to help upskill them and things like that. But I think it also shows you as a brand where you have an absolute critical risk sitting in your supply chain, because if you have a supplier who is really has not grappled with environment yet and the environmental risks, then that is a supplier who might be a critical part of your supply chain who is not climate resilient. They may have suffered already the impacts of climate change, physical impacts of climate change, and that might actually start to get worse and interrupt the business processes that needs to happen. And I always say things to, if you have a supplier who doesn't know very much about climate, then can you be certain that their warehouses or their factories are not sitting on floodplains and don't have good flood defences, or whatever physical risk is important in their locality. So this is a really great place for you to find out the risks, find out the risks that sit in your supply chain, and think and talk with your supplier about how you can make them more resilient, to make your own business more resilient. And we have a clause called Raphael's clause, which is a supplier due diligence questionnaire that you can take inspiration from to get the conversation going in the right direction. What else can you do? I talk to your lawyers, talk to your in-house legal teams, talk to your external panels, ask them what needs to be in your contracts to make climate goals a reality. Point them to our work, please, obviously, point them to the TCLP's work, but know that we expect people to talk about our clauses. We expect people to rip apart our clauses and rebuild them and remake them until they work for your industry and your situation, adapt them, put them in contracts. But I think it is high time that we were going to our lawyers and saying, hang on a minute, climate's a really big risk here. I've made a very public statement saying that I'm going to meet net zero. What in my contracts is delivering that for me? What in my contracts is not delivering that for me? And you, my lawyer, how are you going to fix that? And then lastly, obviously, this is our kind of area of expertise, is contractual terms. And I think there are generally sort of two options for the party with the greater bargaining power in a situation, in a contract situation. One is carrot, you can reward somebody for the behaviours that you want, and one is stick, you can punish them for the behaviours that they don't meet. You can, of course, impose damages or penalties, as we've talked about in Owen's clause. If your supplier is unable to meet climate obligations, you can give them a reward, though, if they do. Low margin industries tend to be places where penalties don't really work, because there is no slack in the system for the penalty to have the effect that it needs to have and it would have in a different industry. And this is where I wanted to go back to Owen's clause and talk about how it's been adapted. So in the UK, the Environment Agency has a huge amount, much to my surprise, has a huge amount of construction contracts. I do know from bitter personal experience that the margins in the construction industry are wafer thin. They are absolutely cut to the bone, as we would say. And the Environment Agency recognised very early on that a liquidated damages or a penalties regime was never going to work in this industry, because there was nowhere left for a liquidated damages scheme to sit. So what they did was they said, okay, we're going to set a carbon target for the contract. That carbon target is going to reduce year by year, but we're not going to have a penalty if people fail to meet the carbon target. What we will do instead is that we will say, if you meet the carbon target, brilliant, but if you beat the carbon target, if you reduce even more carbon than we expected you to, there's a reward mechanism in place. And this is brilliant for the Environment Agency because it worked on two levels. It incentivized their subcontractors and their suppliers far more than a penalty, but it also meant that instead of the Environment Agency having to chase its suppliers and check up on them to see if they were meeting the targets, the suppliers came to the Environment Agency with proof of their success, and that reduced the burden on the Environment Agency. So that was a real win-win situation. If you could move on to the next slide. Thank you very much. So this is an example of some case studies we have where our clauses are already being implemented across business, also government agencies and jurisdictions. Salesforce has been using our clauses for nearly 2 years now, I think, in their supply chain contracts. NatWest has put our clauses in 140 of their supply chain contracts or supply chain precedents. But I think that possibly the most interesting one here, apart from the Environment Agency and what they have done, I think the most interesting one for you might be Vodafone. So Vodafone has implemented a number of supply chain clauses, but it's tailored them and it's tailored the process in a very specific way. So that what Vodafone has done is it's divided their suppliers into two groups, large, sophisticated corporates and small to medium enterprise businesses. The due diligence requirements are very different for those two groups. The due diligence requirements for the small to medium enterprises who are working with a lot less resources are much lower than they are for the larger corporates. And the clauses that these small to medium enterprise businesses have to abide by are less strict and less comprehensive than the ones for the larger corporates. And they're doing this very deliberately. This is not going to be the case forever. But the idea is to give those small to medium enterprises time to get their expertise and get their business up to the stage where Vodafone expects the large and sophisticated corporates to already be operating at. But they're very much looking at it as them nurturing and looking after their small to medium enterprise suppliers. There's another train coming, sorry. You will note there are absolutely no fashion brands or fashion manufacturers on this slide. I really want to change that. If you are inspired by anything we have said here today, then please do contact me afterwards and let's see if we can get a really amazing case study of some fashion houses or fashion brands and manufacturers on this slide as well. That would make me incredibly happy. Thank you. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. This is the last substantive slide, and then we'll move to questions. Often, I think I've mentioned this already, it isn't just what decarbonisation or what climate clauses you have in your contracts. And I think in an industry like fashion, that might even be the wrong starting point. The key is, how do the contractual terms that you currently have in place support or undermine your climate goals? And I think that fashion, like all industries, fashion is going to be one of those industries where there is going to be change right the way from consumer behaviour through boardroom priorities, through the ways of working from the manufacturers, all the way down to how cotton farmers are farming in their small and local communities. But I think contract terms are really important here because they don't only give us the opportunity to put decarbonisation clauses in, they lock us into behaviours because there are consequences to changing those behaviours and breaching contract. And so I think that where fashion should start, and ask your lawyers to start looking at your contracts and saying, where in my existing terms and conditions could I make a change, rather than potentially introducing a brand new clause? Where could I make a change to bring in a level of decarbonisation from the get-go before you even look at Chancery Lane Project clauses? And I'm going to use an example here from the construction industry because that's what I know. In the construction industry, we have standard form contracts. I think that you don't really have them in the fashion industry, but globally, most construction contracts are actually done on a small number of existing standard forms. And one of the clauses in those standard forms says that goods used in the construction must be of new and merchantable quality. And what this means as in the construction industry is that if you have bought too much steel on a previous job and it's still in its wrapping, you cannot use it on a new job because it is not technically new. And so one of the things that I would always say to people in the construction industry is look for your clauses, strip out the word new, put whatever other quality requirements you need to have in, but strip out the word new, because recycled materials can meet all of those requirements, those quality requirements that you have. And by just taking out the word new, you're going to be removing waste. And of course, if you're wasting something like steel, which has an incredibly high carbon footprint, you're already making a massive carbon saving before you're even taking one of our decarbonisation clauses and putting it in your contracts. So look to your existing terms and conditions. Where are there things in those terms and conditions which you could bear? And suppose I'm talking to the brands again here. Could you bear slightly lower profit margin? Could you bear slightly less inconvenience in order to eradicate a large chunk of waste which is locked up in your contract terms? I've put down here on this slide a few examples of things that I think could be really useful or interesting in a fashion context. I've probably got it all wrong, and you can tell me that in the Q&A section, but they may be interesting things for you to look at. Firstly, circular economy principles. This is decoupling economic activity from resources that can run out. And it's very, very closely aligned to my third bullet point on this slide of waste. If a brand, for example, makes last-minute changes to a garment run, which requires a number of garments to be wasted or thrown away, that is a place where immediately you could have a carbon saving, but it would potentially require a brand to change the way that it makes changes and the process it makes changes with its manufacturers. I think delivery times, if we look at delivery times, If you give bigger delivery times to manufacturers, then that allows for a greater use of more sustainable and greener transport options, shipping instead of air freight, which is a better option. It's not a perfect option, because I don't think we have perfect options right now, but it is a better option. Again, as look at your profit margin, are there changes that can be made there which would allow manufacturers to make better investments in new equipment, pay for more power to run that new equipment, for farmers to change their cotton farming procedures and techniques. In an industry with no flexibility on profit margin, it's really hard to make changes. So what could be done here? And yes, this, as I said, this might mean a brand taking a lower profit margin. And lastly, what is the scope in your industry and your business for longer term planning, sharing financial incentives with your manufacturers, brands and manufacturers sharing financial incentives through long term planning? Maybe there's a scope here, as I know has been done in other industries, for brands to potentially give low cost loans to their suppliers to buy new equipment, which means things can be done at a better carbon emissions rate. Yes, I think that I'm proposing here changes which might cut brands' profit and which may mean that things won't be as nimble or as flexible, and there will be challenges. But I think the problem that we have with the current model is that's not going to get the carbon emissions that people have signed up to. So what are the business changes and the behaviour changes that you might need to put in place in order to meet the climate goals, so that when you do take a decarbonisation clause like Owen's clause, it is a full success, everybody's happy, the carbon comes out, and you meet your net zero goals that you've made? I think that we have 60%, I think, 60 or 70% of fashion industry emissions sitting in the supply chain. And this is what we need to be looking at to get it unlocked in your contracting. And that's it. If you could move on to the last slide. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for listening. I do apologise if I've massively mischaracterised your industry. If you are at all interested in our work, please visit our website, sign up for our newsletter. I've put mine and Clarissa's emails here, and we'll leave this slide up during the Q&A section. So feel free to email me if you have any questions. And that's it. I would love to hear your questions, and if you don't have any, I've actually written down 2 questions that I would like to ask the people in the room. So I suggest you ask your own question before you're required to answer mine.
Look, thank you very much, Becky, and to Clarissa and Ben. You made contracts interesting, which is in itself well done. I speak from a non-legal perspective, but I found that was really interesting. I enjoyed that very much. I can see there's no questions in. So look, Becky, why don't you just go ahead and give us your questions, get the ball rolling.
Great, okay. Fantastic. So my question is, what are you seeing any clauses in the fashion industry at the moment relating to decarbonisation and GHG? So one of the things that I've talked about at other seminars in the past is how historically ESG clauses, or particularly the E part of ESG, tended to be a catch-all clause that said you will comply with our sustainability policy. And that's a terrible clause. There's a terrible clause for a lot of reasons, but usually it's most terrible because the sustainability policy is written to be an internal document, not a contractual obligation that you would put in a supply chain contract. So I always hate that. What we're trying to do at TCLP is to bring a lot more specificity to ESG clauses, particularly the E bit. We don't really do the S and E, G, but the E bit where we say actually there's a specific carbon footprint, there's a carbon target here, and this is what will happen if you don't meet it. And I'm just curious as to what sort of climate clauses already exist or don't exist in the fashion industry generally.
While they're thinking on that, give us question number 2, Becky.
I will do. My second question is that we're always looking for feedback on what we do. What clauses would you need or want to put in your contracts from both the manufacturer and a brand perspective to make your climate goals happen? And are there any areas that you can think of where your existing terms and conditions, like that construction example I gave, are actually blocking you from doing the carbon reduction work you want to do?
Yeah, I think, yeah, I would like to know, yeah, there's probably a nice research project based on those two questions, to be honest, for some master's or PhD student listening. You're looking for a project, there's some great questions to begin with. But while people are thinking about that, Becky and Ben, Clarissa, can you see Joseph Strasser's question there? Thanks a lot for this great insight. I'm wondering how practical are your solutions for buyers with hundreds of suppliers? I've worked in construction, you know, there's also large numbers of suppliers, as this is the most dominant business model of between importers and traders in between. So there is this sort of middleman layer in between often. What needs to be done so these clauses are adopted by the entire industry? So I think there's two questions there. Who wants to take a shot at that?
I'm very happy to, unless one of my colleagues wants to jump in. So I think that
I'm going to put the Salesforce case study and their sustainability exhibit in the chat, Becky, so you might want to refer to that.
wonderful. Thank you, Ben. So I think I'm going to sort of start with your last question, which is what needs to be done so these clauses are adopted by the entire industry. And I don't know, I'm not familiar, probably not as familiar as I should be coming into this webinar, with the sort of trade bodies that you have in the fashion industry, but we have absolutely had conversations with trade bodies and sort of standard setters, I think, in other industries to say, you know what, if you recommended this as best practice, then that is going to get a lot more uptake, I think. So that's the first thing. And I think obviously that we need to be really careful here about competition or antitrust law, depending on which jurisdiction you're sitting in, to make sure that this doesn't fall foul of that legislation. But I know that at least in the UK that there are changes being made to competition law specifically so that people can take more concerted carbon reduction action. So I think that you're either going to be a brand with sufficient buying power that you can just go ahead and do it and let the rest of the industry follow in your wake. And we've certainly seen that with sort of global leading corporations doing that. I think that NatWest for us probably falls into that that bracket, as does Salesforce. I think that otherwise you're looking at what are the trade bodies and the trade associations who should be having conversations about how to get this done. I think there are some blockers to it. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I'm not going to pretend this is a perfect solution. I think the biggest blocker to implementing our work is something totally outside our control, which is how do you monitor this? How do you review this? How do people report on it? Because at the moment, carbon reporting, there's 101 different standards out there. And we've certainly heard from suppliers problems where they are being asked to report on their carbon emissions in 15 different ways using 30 subtly but importantly different calculation formulas with 15 different reporting dates. And I think that the sooner that administrative burden, which is completely unnecessary, that could be conformed, and I think an industry could certainly come round an effort to conform that, to remove that burden from everybody. I think that that's a really important thing as well. I hope that's answered bits of your question, if not.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Becky. There's one just coming from Lisa from GIZ as well. Before manufacturers can discuss contracts, there needs to be a willingness to consider buying contracts, codes of conduct, as negotiations, not a one-way street. But I think this is something that came up in earlier in the discussion about partnerships. I think you hit the nail right on the head there with you know, partnerships has been a hot topic in the fashion industry, particularly during COVID, where we saw enormous wage theft, and I'm sure you saw those stories in the UK as well, and still going on, by the way. So, you know, as negotiations, not a one-way street, that the supplier signs regardless of the feasibility of making them happen. Not much shared responsibility at the moment. So I guess my question is, how do you engage suppliers and manufacturers in this conversation when drafting clauses?
I think that's a great question, and I think I alluded to it in my section of my talk, where I sort of said I'm basically talking to the brands now, because you're the ones who have the power to make these changes happen. It's the conversations that need to happen in your boardrooms. I think that the example again I would bring is from the construction industry. I do apologise that the construction industry is my go-to, because it is an industry which has disparity of bargaining power and incredible low margins in places. So I think that although it's not a perfect map for fashion, it does work. And so what the Environment Agency did was it said, we are a buyer, if you like, or a contractor, as would be the terminology in the construction industry. And it is, and because we're the Environment Agency, it's ridiculous. We absolutely need to get this stuff right on carbon. Otherwise, it's just, if we can't do it, who's going to do it? So in our position as a buyer, we are going to be really proactive about this. And we're going to put it at the heart and center of what we do. We are going, and what they did was they got all of their suppliers in a room. They said to them, we're thinking of how we can make our contracts more less carbon intensive. We think we're going to put some terms and conditions in those contracts, but before we just send you a contract with those terms and conditions in, they ran some big roundtable discussions with their suppliers. They got everybody in a room. They had many, many discussions. They looked at many different solutions. I think the advantage to this was that they then came up with a lot of different ways of drafting our clauses. They took our clauses and they really took them apart and rewrote them, and changed them to bring in that reward mechanism, as I said. And that was done because they did this consultation exercise. I think there had to be trust on the part of the suppliers that their ideas would be listened to and that change would really happen, that it wasn't just a talking shop. And of course, what the Environment Agency did was that it actually implemented the changes that were suggested by the suppliers. Not all of them, of course, but it did implement them. And that built in itself a relationship of trust. The suppliers felt consulted and they saw that their suggestions were acted upon by the person with the power to put them into the contracts. And I think that that was so important and so powerful. So I think it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, if I'm honest, Lisa, in that in order to get your suppliers and manufacturers properly engaged, there has to be trust there. How do you get that trust? By trying to engage them and really listening to them and really making changes. So again, I hope I didn't skip that too much.
could I just add on to that and also take into account Sunil's comment? I think, Sunil, I've just dropped 2 links in the chat that relate to the project you're talking about. So the American Bar Association hosts a project run by Rutgers University in New York, which is looking at model contract clauses that align with the United Nations Guiding Principles on Human Rights. That project's developed the concept of shared responsibility across the body of contracting, and also the concept of responsible exit, because when when buyers exit, the problems cascade back down to the suppliers. Both are really important concepts. They're coming out of human rights, and we're working with this project who are funded by and supported by GIZ to think about how the concepts of shared responsibility and responsible exit can be applied into the field of climate. It's really exciting. And I think, Sunil, that's the initiative that you're referring to in your comment.
Yeah,
yes,
thanks.
great. Thank you.
Yep, you got it bang on.
I really commend those resources to you as well as obviously ours, but it's a fantastic toolkit.
But I think
George,
you're absolutely right. That again, I would say that I try to orient them at brand, become keenly aware that the manuals have no wiggle room here, Lee.
Yeah, thanks, Becky. You're just breaking up a little bit, but George has put the survey link in. If you can please take a moment to fill out the feedback form if you're an attendee. We really value that. We agreed upon 60 minutes, Becky, Clarissa, and Ben. And I know you're busy people and it's the start of your day, even though it's the end of mine. but you've got work to do. I'm going to call it to a close. I really feel this is probably something worth revisiting at some point. I think there's a lot here, and I think we just started scratching the surface. I will say that the case study that Ben put in the chat box for the Salesforce case is worth looking at for the fashion industry. When I went to the Chancery Project website, that's the one I focused on, and I thought that seemed relevant to the industry we're talking about. So I would urge anyone really looking for a case study about how this works. The Salesforce one certainly does bear a resemblance with what would be familiar with people on this talk. You've got yeah, Ben.
Sorry, Stephen. Can I just quickly commend people to the second link, which is a PDF to the actual sustainability exhibit that Salesforce appended to their supplier contracts, because you can see the exact form of wording that a buyer can put into a broad set of supply contracts. And it's really short and it's really simple wording. I'm not a lawyer, and I understand it, which is a rare thing. Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, I can vouch for that. I read it. I also understood it. And I don't even work for an organisation that employs lawyers, so I'm one step below you. As I say, I think we're just scratching the surface here, and this is something I think would be really interesting to revisit in a further session. Thank you, everybody. Thank you to our speakers. We really appreciate your time. As I said at the opening of this online seminar, even though this seems to have taken off in other industries, I think this is still a unique and interesting topic for the fashion industry. And it's certainly one I hope this starts a conversation. I hope, Becky, you get a fashion brand that you can put on your page. I endorse your wishes there. I hope we can see nice logo there that we can all relate to in this industry. So thanks very much for your time. That's all from us here on behalf of GIZ Fabric. Thank you very much.